This morning, our sermon is based on Schindler's List. How many of you have seen the movie Schindler's List? Okay, so that's a fair representation. It's not a movie that I recommend you take your children to. Just so you know, there's absolute nudity. It is not a movie for children. But if you want a movie that's pretty historically correct, it's very excellent. Steven Spielberg did a great job. And today we're going to take a look at some lessons that we can learn from Schindler's List. The scene of the movie is Germany, the opening scenes anyway, are Germany during World War II in the late 1930s. Oskar Schindler was a Czechoslovakian opportunist. He had failed in multiple business attempts in Czechoslovakia before the war, came to the war realizing that he could perhaps make some money because war is a very profitable proposition for many people, and many people became very, very wealthy over the war. And so Oskar Schindler has a very fine suit. The opening scene, he takes all the little money he's had tucked away, and he goes and he bribes a maitre d', and he gets a very fine table, and he buys food for all these German officers. And when people whisper, he's paid the maitre d' to say, "Oh, you don't know? That's Oskar Schindler," and so he gets this mysterious reputation, and he curries favor with the Germans. He's a member of the Nazi Party. He curries favor with the Germans. In fact, as they're pulling the Jews out of their home, he takes a Jewish home and makes it his own, and he lives there throughout the war. So for some unknown reason, he knows about Itzhak Stern, and he pulls Itzhak Stern off of a train bound for who knows where, probably Auschwitz or Treblinka. He pulls him off of a train, and he says to him, a good accountant is very, very valuable, and you get the idea that he wants him to kind of make shifty with the books. So Itzhak becomes his accountant, and then he actually, this is how opportunistic Oskar Schindler was. He actually uses the Jews to get the money to buy the factory to make the Jews forced labor. So he goes to Itzhak and he says, "Look, I know you've been pulled out of your countries. I know you guys can't work. I know you have money. Why not give it to me? And I'll build this enamelware factory, and we'll make enamelware, and I'll be rich." So Itzhak tells him, as they're going through a scene where they're setting up the factory, he said, "You pay Jews 5 mark, but you don't pay them personally. You pay it to the Germans." He said, "Poles are a little more," and he goes down the list. And Itzhak is standing there, and Oskar Schindler turns to him and says, "So why would I hire Poles?" So he hires Jews for his factory in the beginning only because they are cheap, only because they are the least expensive. But Oskar did not realize that Itzhak was probably a pretty wise man, as I'm sure the story would be told. And he fills the entire factory with Jews. You have rabbis making enamel pots. You have silversmiths and goldsmiths making enamel pots. You have women making enamel pots. He has a one-armed man that he calls an essential worker, because being an essential worker keeps you it doesn't keep you out of the ghetto, but it lets you leave the ghetto to go to work. The ghetto being the place where they herded all the Jews and put them. Oskar lives an incredibly lavish lifestyle. He wastes a lot of money on just fine things. And I don't know, but the man loves women. Let's just leave it there. The man loves women. And his wife comes to visit him while he's engaged with a fine woman. And Oscar looks at his wife and says, no, actually, you'd like her. She's really nice. So he has this whole unrighteous kind of lifestyle. And he says, during one dialogue, he says, look, at the height of my father's business, his father was a very successful businessman, he had 50 workers. He said, I have 350. So this is about proving himself. This is about, hey, Dad, you think I'm a failure? Look at me now. I have this factory. I have 350 workers. I am wining and dining with the elite of the German army, the German regime. I am in big. But little by little, Oscar sees little things that, I don't know that they make him uncomfortable, but they make him think. And he starts to turn as one day, as he and his wife are riding horses out in the German countryside above the ghetto, and he sees the ghetto being emptied. So let's show the first clip. I think his first thought was, there go my workers. Because his workers all lived in the ghetto. And he had to go, and he had to get his workers back so that his work could continue, and he could continue to make money. His goal was to make steamer trunks full of money. Oscar continues to see injustice, specifically with very high German officials' maid that he chose out of a lineup of Jewish women that were in a camp. And he sees the injustice that is happening to her. He sees people herded on trains. And in one scene, you can tell his heart is starting to shift, because as the people are herded on the trains, it's hot. And the people are in the trains, and they're packed in like cattle. And they're literally, you can't sit down, you can't move. They're packed in so tight that people are dying and they can't fall down, because they're packed in so tight. So you might be around three live people and a dead person behind you that is now leaning on you, but you can't move. And Oscar looks over and sees a fire hose, and he has to play the role, or he realizes, because he realizes he's a criminal with them. He's a member of the Nazi party, and he can't lose their favor, or he loses his money. But he begins to, you see here where he begins to have a conscience. And he takes the fire hose and he asks if they can spray it on the cars. And the guy says, why would you give dying people water? And he said, let's give them hope. Let's give them hope. And the Germans laugh, and so they spray the cars, and he works feverishly to get more hose and more hose so they can get all the way to the end of the cars, so he can give the Jews at least a little bit of relief, a little bit of water, a little bit of cooling. And so that's one of the times where you see his heart begin to soften. The injustice just continues to raise and raise and raise. One of his workers is taken out, and they attempt to shoot him, and they must try to shoot this man 5 or 6 times. And the gun misfires every time. And finally the Germans walk away, and the man goes back to work. So you just see these times when Oscar is confronted with the inhumanity of what's going on around him and what he's in a de facto way participating in. So finally, we're now into the 40s, and the war is beginning to end. They're starting to ship people out to Auschwitz, just to all the people they have in the labor camps. They're starting to liquidate them. That's a nice way of say them murder them. That's, liquidate. That means stand up, shoot, kill, gas, murder a whole bunch of people for whatever political purposes you have. So as we watch this next clip, I want you to see that Oscar, in the first clip I showed you, the little girl in the pink coat or the red coat, I think Oscar had hope that that little girl would survive as he watched her go down the road, slip into a doorway. And I think that gave Oscar some kind of hope, I think is the best word, that maybe things weren't quite as bad as they seemed. And then when we see this next clip, you'll see how that turns. It's at this point in the movie where Oskar Schindler begins to realize that he has an opportunity that he had not thought about before. The war is over. He knows he's a criminal. He knows he has to get out. So he packs up all his stuff, gathers up all his money, and he decides to go forward and leave, and just leave all the Jews, all the people, all his workers, all the people he knows, to be liquidated. And he looks at the money in his suitcase, and he goes to the man, the German who you saw in this clip, and he says, "How much for one Jew?" And the man says to him, "I don't know. How much is one Jew worth to you?" And so it's at this point in the movie that Oscar and Itzhak begin to make the list. And they begin to develop this list, and you see them naming every factory worker, every woman, every child. They keep families together. They call them essential workers. They make the list. And he leaves, I forget how many pages it was, but there's 1,100 names on the list. 1,100 names on the list. And he leaves the bottom line on the last page blank. He takes it to that man and he says, "I want you, these are the Jews I want, and here's the money." And he pays him whatever the agreed upon price was for 1,100 Jews. And the last name on the list was the man's maid. And he refuses to give her to him. So they play cards for her. They start to play cards for her. It doesn't exactly work out that way, but she gets on the list. And he has them put in trains, and they're going to go to Czechoslovakia, where he's going to move his factory. He's not going to make enamelware anymore. He's going to make ammunitions, so that they're going to have an ammunitions factory. And he puts them on. They put the men on one train and the women and the children on another train. And the men get to the factory in Czechoslovakia, and all the women get rerouted to Auschwitz. And as Oscar realizes that all the women and children have been rerouted to Auschwitz, he goes to Auschwitz and he fights for those Jews. And so they let the women go and they keep the children. And in one very dramatic scene, Oskar Schindler takes a little girl whose name is Danka. And he takes Danka and he holds up her hand like this, right in the German's face, and he says, "How am I going to polish the inside of a shell without little fingers?" And the German just says, "Okay, take them all." So the children get out, they get rerouted back to the factory. The war is over. Oscar invites all of the guards into the factory. And he says to them, they listen to the radio broadcast that there's been a general surrender and that the war is over. And Oscar says, "Now I'm the criminal. I will be hunted and you will be free." So he says to the German soldiers, he says, "Shoot them now. Just shoot them now, or turn and go home to your wives and your children as honorable men." And one by one, the German soldiers leave, which leads us to my last clip as the war ends. One more person. One more person. I erroneously spoke. I do have one more clip, and we're going to see it now. A life not intended to be lived well. that rescued 1,100 Jews from certain death at Auschwitz. Today, there are more than 6,000 descendants of Schindler Jews. And I think it would be a very interesting study to see what their contributions have been to our world today that would never have happened had Oskar Schindler not had a change of heart. So what can we learn? The very first thing we learn is that Oskar Schindler was a type of Christ because he bought each Jew with a price. And I think of the Jewish tradition at Passover, where the afikomen, which is a representation of Christ, is bought with a price. I think of Jesus, who purchased each of us with a price. For Oskar Schindler, the price was just his wealth. He never was successful in any other business again. So one can only imagine that God ordained Oskar Schindler's purpose to save 1,100 Jews, because he was never wealthy again. We learn, number 2, that circumstances can change a person. It's your choice whether your circumstances change you for the good or for the bad. Oskar could have been turned for the bad, and he could have just walked into the factory and killed his own Jews, killed his own workers. But he allowed himself to be transformed by undescribable, unimaginable circumstances. He allowed himself to be transformed for the good. Third, we learn that we must stand against injustice wherever we find it. Wherever we find it. We must stand against injustice wherever we find it. Micah 6:8 says, "He has shown you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God." How arrogant we are sometimes that we demand God does things our way. How unmerciful we are sometimes in our judgment against others. And how quickly we strive for justice for ourselves in our own circumstances, and how quickly we deny it to those we deem undeserving or unimportant. There's a man named Niemöller, Martin Niemöller is his name, and he says this quote. He was an opposer of the Nazi regime. He was a Lutheran pastor. He was a friend of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who had an opportunity to escape the wrath of Hitler by coming and I don't remember what college it was. It may have been Harvard, maybe one of the Ivy League schools. And he went back to Germany knowing they would kill him. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller were friends. So he says, first they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Now I want to tell you that Niemöller's stand had repercussions that rolled out to this day. And one of the repercussions was that there was a curse put on the Niemöller line that no male child would be born alive. They would all be miscarried. And there were very few little boy Niemöllers. There was a man named Niemöller in a Foursquare church that Pastor Art had oversight over. And in 2002, September of 2002, we were there, and after several miscarriages, Mr. Niemoller's wife found herself pregnant again. And she said, the curse has to be broken. And so the pastor came to me. I was pregnant with Kate, and he said, I know you're pregnant, and I know all the theories about doing spiritual warfare when you're pregnant and all that stuff. He said, but would you mind praying over her? And I said, no, I don't mind. I said, I'm going to have Art pray for me first, and then as long as I'm covered, then I'll go and pray for her. There was a little girl in the circle of prayer that we prayed over her. And as we prayed, and as I laid hands on her stomach, we prayed. I felt nothing spectacular. There were no lightning bolts or anything. But I prayed for her. I felt the power of God. Went on, continued to pray for her that she wouldn't miscarry. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, the pastor came to me and said, I have to tell you what that little girl went home and said to her mom. She said, that little girl said, Mommy, did you see the big black man that left Kathy when that woman put her hands on her tummy? She had a boy. And he'll be 15. Which brings me to my fourth point. One righteous act affects generations. Generations. One little boy, Niemoller. 6,000 Schindler Jews. What else? What else is affected by one righteous act? My last point is, you may not... anyone can be a hero in the right circumstances. When we find the courage within to act. I never intended the night I went to work to pray for a little newborn baby who would die. Wasn't on my radar. But when the opportunity came, I took it. Wasn't on my radar the night I went to work in the intensive care unit and a woman would need a pint of fresh blood, and I just happened to be her type and cross match. But when an opportunity arose, I took it. So I know 2 people who are alive because I took an opportunity that was presented to me. We become heroes when we live out of our values and we go about our business day after day after day. Anybody can be a hero because God only knows I am not special. So whether it's 1,100 Jews, a baby in a newborn nursery, a woman in intensive care, or 2 girls on a bus. Because this morning, I am going to give the first. I can't believe I made it through the whole of Schindler's List. And I'm going to cry now. Oh my goodness. Today I'm going to give the first of hopefully many Chestnut Street Community Church Everyday Hero Awards. And it's going to go to someone who gets on the bus every day and just goes to work. But on that bus were 2 young women who were talked to in very nasty terms by other men on that bus, and were made to feel very uncomfortable and very unsafe every day when they took the bus and went to work. But Ken O'Conti got on that bus, and the girls told their mother, this man is our guardian. This man is our savior. Because when he is on the bus, he never speaks, but somehow we know he is praying. And when he is on our bus, no man ever speaks to us. No man ever speaks crudely to us. And so Ken, if you would come forward. I'm not going to ask you to make a speech. That's what I'm talking about. His name may not be Oscar Schindler. He may not have given a pint of blood. He may not have done some of the things that some of the others of you have done who would count you as heroes. But for two girls who were afraid and intimidated, he became their savior. And the only reason I know this story is because the two girls are daughters of one of the people who work in the school. And she saw a picture on Facebook and realized who he was. And the girl said, "That's the man." Her daughters said, "That's the man. That's the man we've told you about. That's the man who protects us on our bus." Things that are done in secret shall be brought to the light. So we always count that as the bad things. You know, you pray, "Oh Lord, whatever's being done in secret, let it be brought into the light." We pray that against people a lot. Why don't we start praying it for people instead? Why don't we have another attitude adjustment and begin to pray for the heroes among us, the Oscar Schindlers, the Ken O'Contis, the fill in your name. God bless you.